It's such a personal and professional privilege to welcome Christine Finn to the Poetry Room. There's a great poem by John Barrowman about his college days in which he says something like, I forgot to fact check this one, fortune gave me to know my generation's flaming best. Fortune gave Christine Finn and I the opportunity to meet over 20 years ago as graduate students at Oxford University. The same year, I might add, that a young Stephanie Burt, if any of you happen to know that professor, passed through. Oxford is where I received my first poetry prize, chosen by the then Oxford laureate Seamus Heaney. The sum entirety of that award was a pint with the poet at Maudlin's pub. And I am an infamous teetotaler. The backdrop to our conversation was a raging dance party about as loud as the hullabaloo that's about to go down in Harvard Yard tonight, so please excuse the background noise. One thing I found in England and Ireland that I've never entirely found again in such plenty, and this is not about alcohol, is so many enduringly undefined and multiplicitous lives. Lives not nailed down by singular nouns, but a confabulation of activities and disciplines and curiosities that together constitute a life. And some of this, I must say, I attribute to the arts councils of England and Ireland that have never seemed, from afar at least, you may disagree, to have doubted the crucial cultural and social value of lives lived in and through art and literature. Poet, archaeologist, and freelance BBC reporter Christine Finn has, since I met her 2 decades ago, and I should say this is our first reunion since, sacrificed no part of her plenty, but allowed these intelligences to inform her remarkable existence. And tonight they will have the chance to inform our own, as she presents some of the work she's been doing over the past 2 weeks as a part of her WPR, Woodberry Poetry Room, creative grant. Time Tell, as she's called this event as the drumbeat begins, Time Tell is an archaeological assemblage, including recordings from the Poetry Room's archive and found sound. It's gathered in the rooms where Heaney stayed and wrote at Adams House at Harvard, all brought into context with personal reflections on archaeology and Heaney's poetry. Some of it's in progress, and we will be worked on for a presentation at Home Place, about which we'd love to tell you. This is Seamus Heaney's legacy in his own home place in Ireland this summer. Please welcome Christine Finn.
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for that introduction, and it's very moving, and it's wonderful to be here. And I have to thank Christina again, and Mary as well, in the Woodberry Poetry Room, for making me so welcome and also assisting me to put on this performance assemblage. And also Adam's House for giving me the opportunity to work in the Heaney Suite, which has been incredibly moving and powerful and inspirational. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is really, as it is an assemblage, which is an archaeological term for a range of things coming together. Some will seem to be disparate, and some will require close listening, and some may be something that might strain the ear a little bit, but it's all part of the context of sound over time, and certainly in our age of technology, what happens to sound when it degrades and we start to lose the voice. I came here inspired with a project because of a catalogue reading in the Woodberry Poetry Room, where I saw there was, Seamus had read Villanelle for an anniversary, and intriguingly it suggested that the cassette had traces of other poets, notably Robert Frost and MacDermot. And I concentrated on the Robert Frost when I came here, and I found, just coming to this place and sitting here, and I remember coming in and seeing the cassette ready for me to play and feeling this overwhelming sense of a ritual about to take place. And I had deliberately not wanted to hear anything of the cassette before I came over to Harvard. And I'm now going to play you what particularly intrigued me, and that will set the scene for the rest of the assemblage.
Villanelle for an anniversary. A spirit moved. John Harvard walked the yard. The atom lay unsplit, the west unwon. The book stood open, and the gates unbarred. The maps dreamt on like moon dust. Nothing stirred. The future was a verb in hibernation. A spirit moved. John Harvard walked the yard. Before the classic style, before the clapboard, all through the small hours of an origin, the book stood open and the gates unbarred. Night passage of a migratory bird, wing beat, gown flap, like a homing pigeon, a spirit moved. John Harvard walked the yard. Was that his soul, look, sped to its reward by grace or works? A shooting star, an omen? The book stood open and the gates unbarred. Begin again where frosts and tests were hard. Find yourself or founder here. Imagine a spirit moves. John Harvard walks the yard. The books stand open and the gates unbarred. I'll try a second shot at it. Villanelle for an anniversary. A spirit moved. John Harvard walked the yard. The atom lay unsplit, the west unwon. The book stood open and the gates unbarred. The maps dreamt on like moon dust. Nothing stirred. The future was a verb in hibernation. A spirit moved. John Harvard walked the yard. Before the classic style, before the clapboard, all through the small hours of an origin, the book stood open and the gates unbarred. Night passage of a migratory bird, wing beat, gown flap, like a homing pigeon, a spirit moved. John Harvard walked the yard. Was that his soul, look, sped to its reward by grace or works? A shooting star, an omen? The book stood open and the gates unbarred. Begin again where frosts and tests were hard. Find yourself or founder here. Imagine a spirit moves. John Harvard walks the yard. The books stand open and the gates unbarred.
And turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust. Such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They're dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break. Though once they're bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterward, trailing their leaves on the ground like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun.
Well, what can we say?
Welcome to our job.
So I hadn't heard Robert Frost until I was listening to that recording, and the shock of this other voice coming through. But of course it brings up so many archaeological possibilities and forensic possibilities. And Mary Graham, in her earlier research into the cassette, has talked about it being a bootleg copy. And how did it come to be in Heaney's hands? Did he get it from someone here? And how did he come to over-record Frost in such a way? Did he know he'd over-recorded Frost? I've put this question out to various friends to find out. And what Mary has suggested very much in this, now that was obviously recorded in Dublin in 1986, prior to the performance here for the anniversary of Harvard, 350th. But Mary describes the intimacies that listening to a cassette can reveal. And certainly the number of times I listened to this, must have heard it at least a dozen, maybe even 20 times. I was quite fixated on listening with headphones, listening without headphones, listening here, listening in the Heaney suite. And I kept thinking, there's some other sound on there, and maybe it's just me. Oh gosh, the laptop's just suddenly decided to go out. I was thinking maybe it's just me, or maybe I'm hearing, because of doing a lot of radio work, maybe I'm hearing something else going on. So the next chunk of this presentation will involve a lot of close listening, and I am taking some liberties with the idea of poetry performance by presenting something which will be Frost again, but I am asking you to listen out for a dog and a car horn.
Tree at my window, window tree. My sash is lowered when night comes on, but let there never be curtain drawn between you and me. Vague dream head lifted out of the ground, and thing next most diffuse to cloud. Not all your light tongues talking aloud could be profound, but tree, I have seen you taken and tossed, and if you have seen me when I have slept, you have seen me when I was taken and swept and all but lost.
Did you hear the car horn? Yeah. Just at the end? Yeah. And you hear the dog?
With a wave to let us know it hears me.
Plain.
Why, my dear, that wave's been standing off this jut of shore. The black stream, catching on a sunken rock, flung backward on itself in one white wave, and the white water rode the black forever. It's with a wave.
So I found this really intriguing, this extra layer, and I'm grateful again to Mary for helping me pull it out and tease it out. In fact, when I was listening to it again this afternoon, I couldn't hear it, and I wondered whether I'd just really not heard it originally, but I'm glad that you could hear it again. So the idea of archaeology, audio archaeology, is an interesting one, particularly, as I mentioned, in this age of our technology with degrading material. And it's an issue, obviously, very much pertinent to libraries that have audio. And I found that cassettes, particularly, are really intriguing to work with because it's so physical. You either stop it or you start it. And I found, listening to a lot of the digital material, that it becomes terribly complex, that you can't actually get and listen to the piece that you want to get to, because you need to then see a visual array of it, and it becomes a problem. So I want to wind back really to my interest in archaeology and Heaney at this point, and then I will refer back to some of the archive material. As Christina mentioned, I was at Oxford and I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology and anthropology. And during excavating, I found that I was getting back to writing poetry, which I hadn't done for many years. And it coincided with Seamus Heaney being professor of poetry. And I came to his work actually through archaeology. I was doing an option on Celtic art and archaeology and Iron Age Britain, and Iron Age Europe, and I was coming across the bog bodies through that work, and someone suggested I looked at Seamus Heaney's poetry. I was very well versed on Yeats. I went to a convent school, so we had Yeats drilled into us from a very early age. But Heaney was a revelation to me, and it was absolutely wonderful. And so after I finished my my undergraduate degree, I did my doctorate on archaeology and poetry, and it became really the history of archaeology from antiquarianism through the filter of poetry. And I was able to spend 3 days with Anne Yates going through her father's books, looking for any notations in his traveling and travel guides to see what he'd looked at in Sicily with mosaics. And then I was over in Trinity for a year in the English department. And during that time, Seamus Heaney left a message on my answer phone in my little bedsit in Rathgar Road saying that, yes, he would meet me and have a conversation with me. And I was absolutely thrilled. But my time in Dublin, which was a scholarship, coincided with the Celtic tiger booming. And my small scholarship didn't go very far, so I had to have jobs in a mosaic factory, which was very pleasurable, and also invigilating exams. And the day of the interview with Seamus Heaney, I was invigilating a classics exam in one of the halls in Trinity. And I was convinced that there was plenty of time at the end of the examination for me to get to Sandymount, which was about 2 to 3 miles away, and all was well. And I sat there, the exam finished, and people were taking a very long time to thread the papers together with the string in order for them to be collected. And I was sitting there just agonised, watching, please, please, please. Finally, I left the room or the hall and got out, and there was a rainstorm, and all the traffic was halted. There were no buses, there were no taxis, everything was at a standstill. And I started to run, which was slightly crazy because it was 3 miles, as I said, to Sandymount. And I was in that situation where I thought, do I stop and phone Seamus Heaney and say I'm going to be late? But he just won the Nobel Prize. How do you say? So I kept running, and then I noticed a car had stopped at traffic lights, and I banged on the window. And the woman rather nervously wound down the window, and I said, can you take me to Seamus Heaney? And she said, yes. Only in Dublin. And not only did I not need to tell her the address, but she was absolutely thrilled to have this mission to me, like Paddington Bear being delivered to Seamus. And of course we had a wonderful, wonderful conversation over Irish whiskey, and discussing the relationship he had with archaeology, which he talked about quite a bit, and obviously it had been written about quite a bit. But I was approaching it as an archaeologist interested in the poetry rather than the other way round. And at the end of our conversation, because I realised that the longer I was there, that the possibility was that he wasn't writing a poem, and I couldn't have that guilt. So I brought with me a fragment to give him as a present. I didn't know what do you give to someone like Seamus Heaney. And I'd been in Israel and Jordan on a research trip looking at mosaics. And we were allowed to pick up pieces of tessera in the desert, so because it had no context. So I brought back and gave to Seamus Heaney a piece of tessera from the desert and told him about it. And he went to his filing cabinet and he rootled around and he produced a conker. And he said he had picked it up the morning that he'd learned he'd won the Nobel Prize, and he gave it to me. So when I was listening to the material in the archive here, I came across a poem that, with the context, which was another gift to me.
This is called Conkers. I don't know whether conkers exist in New England. They are the chestnuts that you play. Conquerors, I think. You conquer the other chestnut. You have your conquer. All along the dank sunk rock-floored lane to the Acropolis in Sparta, we couldn't help tramping on the burst shells and crunching down the high-gloss horse chestnuts. I thought of kelp and foal's hooves, bladderwort, dub leather, as I bent to gather them, a hint of ordure coming and going off their tainted pith. Cyclopic stone on each side of the path, rings of defence, breached walls, the looted conkers gravid in my satchel, swinging nicely. Then a daylight moon appeared behind Dimitri as he sketched and squared his shoulders like a centaur's and nodded towards the spouses, heard but not seen behind much thick acanthus.
So he was in Greece when he learned he'd won the Nobel Prize, but that was so special for me to have that extra context. I mentioned that I became interested again in poetry. I was reawakened in poetry in the way that Seamus Heaney talked about the Tollan man reawaking something in him. He knew friends who were archaeologists in Belfast, and he found the whole process of archaeology absolutely fascinating. And I found within archaeology myself a way to express. It was a new language. I'm not a linguist in any way, but suddenly I found a way to converge ideas. And I had my first ever poem was published at Oxford, and it was chosen by Simon Armitage for an anthology of Oxford and Cambridge poetry. And it was one of those poems that sort of came into my head And I know where I was standing on the high near my college, Queen's. And I'll just read it to you. It's called Pocket Finds. They pop up like ghosts, the scraps of names confused with notes and old receipts, or jammed into drawers full of useful bits. They grow like a tell, in layers of exchange with persons met on buses, encounters with promises to keep in touch, pop by if passing. The years pass by instead. The scraps become the calling cards of absent friends. A tell is an archaeological name for layers of an occupation, generally in Mesopotamia, places like that. And so it's just a beautiful word to be able to use in that context as well. I'm now going to go back to Seamus. When I was going through all of the recordings here, all the recordings at least that were accessible, I was trying to find which poem it was that he read the most at Harvard. And it was, I might have started a book on this actually, in terms of a gambling book, because it looked like it was going to be either alphabets or punishment. It was actually a very close call. But suddenly the winner came through, and it was Personal Helicon, which is a very appropriate poem, because it was the one that ended, was included in his first collection, Death of a Naturalist, and it's a very personal poem going back to childhood. So what I did, again with the help, was to take, it was performed 5 times over 5 different years, and by chance it had 5 stanzas. So what I did was take a stanza for each year, and what you'll hear first is the latest one in 2000, and then it goes back through time to 1975. So this is Heaney reading Personal Helicon over time.
As a child, they could not keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drops, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope. So deep you saw no reflection in it. A shallow one under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. Others had echoed, gave back your own call with a clean new music in it. And one was scarcesome, for there as ferns and tall foxgloves, a rat flapped across my reflection. Now to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare, big-eyed Narcissus, into some spring, is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. As a child,
Right. I mentioned about technologies earlier on. That was obviously not as pristine a recording as it could have been. I was using my BlackBerry because I wanted to, in some way, get back to the authenticity of that cassette. The clicks you heard were me turning it on and off and actually trying to coordinate it with the laptop and what I was hearing digitally as well. This is a work in progress, that particular one, but I was quite intrigued to see whether we could pick up any change in tone with Heaney over time. And remarkably, I think he sounds very similar over 20-odd years. I'm going to play something else now, which is a bit of a test. You have a copy of The Tollen Man there. This is a CD from 2004. And it's an example of the problems we have with technology. It has degraded over time. But listening to it, and I actually went across to Daedalus, had a pint of Guinness and listened to it on headphones. Daedalus was a place where, as you will know, I'm sure Heaney enjoyed going and having a pint. But it felt an appropriate place to hear something which was going to be painful. And what you hear in this is sound reduced to zeros and ones, and it's very, for me, archaeological because it's also going back into dust in a sense. It's going into the soil, if there is an audio soil that we can describe. And well, as I said, it will be not an easy read, but I should say. But I recognised it because I know this poem very well because of the Bog Body poems, and I heard the shape of it, and that was my way of interpreting it. But you can at least read.
Someday I will go to Ormuz to see this peace body, the married hope of the island, its skin cap. In the fact of when he died in the building out, his heart griddle winter food, baked in the smoke, naked except for cap, loose and girdle, would stand long idle. Right going to the nest, she tightened her pork on him, with her fan. Those dark juices licking in to his face kept bloody, filled with the tough covers honeycomb workings, rubbing his skin face with poisonous buttons.
You can still hear it though. You can still, it's such a strong, powerful poem that there is still that rhythm that comes through there. But there's also that sense of something fading away, which is actually very poignant, I think, and also when you consider the Tollem man himself. And also the whole idea of the bog bodies being preserved, and then once they're out of the bog, they become fragile and can possibly decompose and disappear. So you've got an interesting tension there that I want to work with more. So in my time in the Heaney suite, which has been remarkable and poignant, I've been gathering sound. And again, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to suspend your usual oral pleasure and listen out for something, which is, again, an archaeology of the space. I gather that the Heaney suite is going to be part of a revamping at some point, and there's radiators, which are very classic in Adam's house, which I think those of you who live there will recognise. And I thought I ought to gather some of this sound. And again, I'm using my faithful BlackBerry. I will play you.
If you're having trouble hearing, just cup your ear like anything else in there.
Yeah.
You can hear a little better.
Thank you, Christina, for mentioning it. So think of these as little stanzas that I will be playing with afterwards, before I go to Ireland, and making into another sound poem. It was actually quite hard to grab because whenever I went to one radiator that was sounding, the other one was sounding louder. And if someone had filmed me rolling around, in fact, one of the students from the creative writing mentioned it yesterday. Were you recording the radiator?
We never have a fellow in the
Yeah, exactly. I'm so sorry. So the other thing I recorded today, which of course is Seamus Heaney's birthday, which is another thing we ought to be, this is one of the reasons for presenting today. A dog outside the Heaney suite. So there we have a riposte to Frost Dog, dog bark. And the final one in the Siddle sequence is something that will be very, very familiar to those of you who know Seamus Heaney's poetry.
I'll just end with a poem.
It's a rain stick. And he, in a poem, maybe I'll stop this. It's actually quite intense, isn't it? Yeah. It's beautiful, but intense. And there's a rain stick in the Heaney suite as a memento to his love of the rain stick and the poem that he dedicated to it. And finally, I'm going to give you a clear reading of Seamus Heaney, having been all the way around the houses with the archaeologists, to go back to a poem which I thought I would hear much more in the readings. In fact, I didn't hear it more than once. It's the poem which is on the door of the Heaney suite, and it's the one which I think connects so much with archaeology and poetry, and it's digging. And at the end of it, I think you might connect back to the rain stick in some oral way.
I'll just end with a poem called Digging, which is the first poem in this book. Come round to the beginning through the end. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, absolutely.
Shall we
Yes.
cut the cake, or shall we go?
Yeah, whatever.
And I just hand this around so that it can be recorded anonymously.
Any questions?
There's no
No
pressure.
questions?
Sometimes that's not what comes immediately, just appreciation. Okay, so, Vanny.
Yeah, I just thought that the wonderful static and sound of this recording that came out of this box here was so like the radio during the war, and that's another layer, of sound that you can do association
Absolutely.
with time
Yeah,
and history,
yeah. That's
and that did come out to me at the box.
good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I still think the cassette is the clearest of everything that we're hearing. It feels so fundamental, and the fact that you can see it and you can spool it, and it's really
it's like
amazing.
The old VHS.
Yeah.
Using your BlackBerry, you're using a form of radio.
Yeah.
You're using your BlackBerry, you're using the radio.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I haven't progressed to an iPhone. I stick with the BlackBerry. So
Oh no,
old
I just
technology.
mean the radio waves.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
yes, but it's
I didn't mean you were using old technology.
No, but it is. But the point is,
yeah.
the point is, I chose it deliberately because
Okay.
it is visceral.
Right.
You know, it's very tactic and haptic. And, yeah, so there are things I can click, basically, turn it on and off.
The CD that deteriorated, is that just a problem with CDs in general?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
what does one do to preserve?
Well, there are other recordings on our two other types of technology of that same performance
That last
are being
better?
Yeah, so hopefully seeing if we can get that off, I think that's in process, isn't it? Possibility.
A very interesting issue, and
Yeah.
one that really,
Yeah.
some of the more recent technologies, the sort of arrogance of the new is sort of in evidence through that CD, really.
I made a radio program for Radio 4 about called Tales from the Digital Archive, which was about the problems that biographers are going to have in years to come, because so many archives now are being given, like I was using British Library as an example, and they're all digital and they can't get the material off in the way that, because I'm a biographer myself of Chiquetta Hawkes, but at least I can go through files. But if it's digital, you know. And another area I work in is retro technology, and a lot of the people in Silicon Valley who are laughed at for collecting old computers are now much in demand because it's like the Rosetta Stone. They've got the manuals, they can get into this data. Yeah. But it's a very important question.
I just have an observation, really more than anything, was just how alike the sound of the rain stick and the sound of the applause at the end.
That's just, yes.
It's just really
Good.
remarkable to me.
Good. I'm glad you felt that. That's good.
We used to think, and I think it was true, that on cassette tapes, you picked up the sounds of trucks in Iowa, that there were all these mysterious sounds coming in. Did you ever have that?
Almost like early photography.
Yeah, exactly, and no one knew where they were coming from.
Well, I don't know how conscious Frost was of the car outside and the dog.
But this was not even being recorded, it was in the tape.
I see.
Does anybody remember that?
Oh.
Time? You do, yeah. No, it was a mysterious quality of the cassette, that it carried other sounds.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because that cassette is an American one, and you know it's almost like taking it back to Dublin. It imported something of America in the very materiality of it, which is interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've actually been able to ascertain exactly what address that was. It had been sort of mislabeled, and I've been able to track it back to Boston, to the address. It was, somebody had said it was Cambridge in the label, but in fact it's in Boston and Beacon Hill. So.
It's very forensic. All these things come together.
Shall we cut cake? Or one more question? Or observation? Did anyone here know Seamus in the room? Could you raise your hands if you... Fanny, Anne, yes, 3. Me, Daniel, Winchell. You.
And I have a recording of that interview that I did with him, but that is, I can't find it. And the terrible thing about it, it's gone through various moves. It is in storage, but I don't know which box I can find it. So that's
a very imaginative version of the word have.
Yeah. So it's there to be exposed at some point.
We would love to have it.
Yeah. I would love to have it at the moment. Yeah. But the lovely thing was that I wasn't interviewing him as a journalist, I was interviewing him as a scholar, and it was a very personal conversation in that way. So it's wonderful.
You've carried forward his spirit today, I think.
Thank you. I felt him very strongly in the rooms, actually. And there was one extraordinary day, I don't want to hold you up from the cake, but
Sorry, I should never have
described, which I described to Christine. Christina, it was, I think, the second day that I was in the rooms, and there was, as I was walking to Adam's house, to go into the suite, there was a flood, and it was a burst water main. And it was so beautiful, and I was really thinking of poetry and thinking about how I wanted to record this. So I actually documented it and filmed it, and a guide there was really worried that I was going to report somebody and said, well, it's only water. But I just was utterly fascinated, and I realised that I was now going into a different space, in more poetic space, where I was allowed to do that. And I went in to the rooms, then came out and met Christina, and then came back in later on. And suddenly I heard somebody, as I was working, saying, oh, better get the fire department. And I looked out, and there was just yards from where this pit had been dug to fix this water main, was a car smoking, which then exploded into flames.
Oh, God.
And it was the most extraordinary thing to witness these two things within the space of a few hours.
And the person whose car it was is a literary critic.
Yeah, the person who's car in front of it, because that was the other mysterious thing, is that they traced the person whose car ignited, and the fire brigade came out, and they drove off, took the car away, and I happened to come out of the building at the same time as the person whose car in front had come out to examine his car, and was shocked to find all this blistering, melted number plate, and had no idea what had happened. There was no context, there was no note on the car. And I guess it turned out to be a literary critic. At least I had the documents, I had the photographs, and I was able to explain what had happened. And also then became his witness for the insurance. So I thought that was a very Seamus story that would be really, I wanted to share with him. Yeah. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful fortnight, and thank you again very much for hosting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.